I'm unclear on that. Good evening. Welcome to the June 4th meeting of the Everett Planning Commission. Ayana, would you please take the roll?
Chair Chatters.
Here.
Commissioner Adkins.
Here.
Commissioner Ballard.
Here.
Commissioner Shelby.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Atkins, would you read the land acknowledgement?
Yes, the Planning Commission wishes to acknowledge the original inhabitants of this place, the Shahobs people, and their successors, the Tulalip tribes. Since time immemorial, they have hunted, fished, gathered on, and taken care of these lands and waters. We respect their sovereignty, their right to self-determination, and honor their sacred spiritual connection with the land and water. We will strive to be honest about our past mistakes and bring about a future that includes their people, stories, and voices to form a more just and equitable society.
Thank you. Okay, so we will hold approval of the minutes from March 21st, and we will resolve those as well as the minutes from this meeting at the next meeting. Okay, commissioners, do we have any reports this evening? All right, staff.
Just two reports for staff comments this evening. Sorry about the flip-flop on the agenda that you may have noticed over the last week. We originally had fences and the continuation of the middle housing item that we were working through last week. Fences was in response to a relatively urgent need to put a fence that was not allowed under our code. And this is actually something that pops up with relative frequency, that we have property owners, even utilities and city departments sometimes that have a need or a desire or something along those lines for a fence that is not permitted under our code. We do not have administrative modification route for the fence standards like we do for many other standards in our code, so it's a fairly rigid set of requirements. I believe that to some extent maybe by design, because it releases staff from having to defend the regulations that could be modified, but staff is unwilling to or doesn't see it as meeting the criteria. But that inflexibility can sometimes cause troubles. We were able to find a way around this issue that popped up a couple of weeks ago, and still think we need the fence ordinance. We're just so busy that if it is not at the utmost level of urgency, we do not have the capacity to take that on. So we're going to wait until we have just a little bit of a capacity or utmost emergency pops up again. I do think some opportunity for administrative modification would be a reasonable step in that case. So we'll consider that matter set aside for a while. We did have another urgent item that popped up that took its place, and that's the Transportation Improvement Program, and you'll hear more about that in a minute from our city engineer, Tom Hood. The other staff comment is an unfortunate one. Commissioner Michael Zielinski has had to resign from the Planning Commission effective immediately due to some personal health reasons. We're pulling together a card that we can circulate and sign. We'll have that ready at the next meeting, and we're thinking of some other ways to thank Commissioner Zielinski for his years of service and really an incredible grasp of the planning frameworks. And every time I listen intently to all of you, but Michael Zielinski has had a particular I think wisdom that he has provided to this commission over years, even before I have been here. So long-standing member, has had a great contribution to the city of Everett, and wish him well. Like I said, we'll circulate a card or something at the next meeting. That's it for staff comments.
Thank you. We now have an opportunity for open public comment, but before we do that, I just wanted to ask commissioners if any of you would like to just send a little message to Commissioner Zielinski, thanking him for his service. Like Yorick said, I listened very intently to Commissioner Zielinski when he spoke. He brought such a wealth of knowledge, depth of knowledge, and he will be missed. So commissioners, I know you'll join me in just thanking him for his service. Commissioner Adkins?
Yeah, I always really appreciated all of the insights Commissioner Zielinski brought to our discussions and sometimes our tense debates. But I always felt he was very respectful, and I will miss him.
I too. Again, we were not always on the exact same side, but I appreciated his ability to very clearly and define things in a simple manner that was easily understood.
I had not had the chance to work with him very long, but as a member of the public, I also appreciated his inputs watching this commission before being a member. So thank you very much for your service.
Thank you, Commissioners, and thank you to Commissioner Zelinski for the work you did for our city for many, many years. We now have an opportunity for public comment. Ayana, do we have anyone online or who signed in the gallery?
No comments.
Okay, thank you. Okay, we will move on to item number 4, the Transportation Improvement Program Annual Update.
And just by quick way of introduction, again, Tom Hood with City Engineer, but as I don't know if it was noted on camera, but we do not have a quorum today. We were seeking a Planning Commission resolution on this item. I think the best we'll be able to deliver is a consensus of the Planning Commissioners present. That may suffice for bringing this item along to the City Council. There is a deadline to deliver this to WashDOT, so we're working on a compressed time frame. If the need arises, we may be back at the next meeting for a formal resolution, but it could be that a consensus, if that's the direction of the commissioners present, will suffice. Tom.
Great. Thank you, Yorick. Good evening, Commissioners. Tom Hood, Public Works staff. I'm here tonight to ask the Commission for a recommendation to City Council for adoption of our 6-year Transportation Improvement Program, what we commonly refer to as the TIP, for the years 2025 to 2030. State law requires adoption on an annual basis of a 6-year TIP for all cities and towns in the state of Washington. And the TIP is essentially a list of projects that supports the goals and objectives of our transportation element of the city's comprehensive plan. It authorizes city staff to pursue and receive funding for the listed projects. I want to point out that the numbering scheme that we use in the TIP is not indicative of any sort of prioritization. It's just a numeric identifier for each project. And I would like to also point out that this year's TIP contains 2 new projects, not on previous year's TIPs. The first one, and these are shown in bold font, by the way, on the TIP list. The first one is the Everett Transit parking lot paving at 33rd and Cedar. That's pretty self-explanatory. Everett Transit uses that lot to store additional buses, and it's in pretty bad shape and can use some paving. The second project is the Safe Streets for All Safety Action Plan projects. The Safe Streets for All, which we often just refer to as SS4A, is a new local road safety program that was created as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law at the federal level. It is a $5 billion program over 5 years it has 2 phases. One is a planning phase and the other is an implementation phase. To be eligible for the implementation grants, a local agency has to have a safety action plan in place that meets the SS4A requirements. The city was successful in obtaining one of those planning grants earlier this year. And so we are launching our safety action plan effort later this year to then qualify in subsequent years for the implementation grants. So that is essentially the update on the plan. And I'll just quickly mention the process for adoption. We have 2 recommendations. One comes from the Transportation Advisory Committee, which we received last month at their May 16th meeting. The Planning Commission, we also seek recommendation from this body as well. And then with those, we move on to full council for adoption by resolution. And then we're required to file that resolution by the end of June each year. So with that, I'll take any questions you might have.
Commissioner Atkins?
Could you just talk more about what specific projects the Safe Streets for All covers?
Sure. We don't actually have any specific projects yet. That will be a product of our safety action plan. But we expect that in addition to identifying specific locations and projects that will be needed, we'll also probably come away with some programmatic type programs out of that that work more in general. The SS4A program is very broad. It doesn't just include engineering solutions, but it includes things like education for drivers and cyclists and peds. It includes an enforcement component. There's quite a few things that go into the safety action plan.
Other questions, commissioners? The SS4A program, is there, I assume that it's going to be looking at the city holistically, but will there be special attention paid to the area around the Park District project where we've heard from the community that there are some specific concerns about the streets there, considering the density that we expect to be present in that area in the future? Will that definitely be one of the spaces that are evaluated for this program?
Well, the Public Works has identified some locations across the city that have more issues than others. For instance, South Evergreen Way has been a problem historically, certain intersections as well. So I can't speak precisely to the EHA project necessarily, but we will be taking a holistic and comprehensive look at all of the areas in Everett, especially the arterials.
Any additional questions, commissioners?
Kind of a same question, or on the same kind of line, I guess, how does the scoring go? I mean, obviously I understand the concerns down on the arterials, and especially where we've had deaths and accidents over the years, and trying to look at that as a priority. But I guess how in this program of this tip does a neighborhood like that get onto a list where it would even be considered to be done?
Well, in terms of the SS4A, that's very data driven. And so we will be using things like you mentioned, the accident data, traffic volumes, traffic speeds, things like that, to identify potential projects. But outside of just SS4A, obviously the update to the comprehensive plan with the transportation element will also be looking at the city holistically and comprehensively for potential projects that are needed based on the anticipated growth in those neighborhoods.
So if a person wanted to talk to neighbors that wanted that to happen, I guess what would be their action? What would you have them do then to make sure that attention was considered and priority was given to that, I guess? I understand you're studying it as, you're doing this holistic look
Right.
on this, but how would they input that in? I mean, I know we've gone around and had meetings and people have, had concerns, but is there more specific ways to make sure that that's addressed in that area?
Yes, a couple of ways. The first way within the SS4A or the comp plan, obviously, the public outreach channels that we've been utilizing is a great way to provide input into the SS4A safety plan. But then also, one could contact Public Works through our webpage, through just our dispatch line, and put in a request, and that request will be routed through the proper channels in Public Works for a look and consideration. We do have, you'll notice on the TIP list, we have a lot of somewhat generic type projects that aren't location specific. And so a lot of those, those would apply to any area in town that met the criteria. So we're not entirely hamstrung by location only on the TIP and our ability to do things.
I think that this sounds very promising because we know that there are needs that are out there, but I guess there are two things that are bothering me. One is the call for outreach in order to study a particular area when we have already heard extensively from this community in this specific area of the city that they have these concerns. So I would ask that it be considered to automatically kind of focus on that area, to evaluate it for the needs that have been expressed by the community already, rather than waiting for them to once again engage in a process of giving information to us. I feel like they have done that. The second thing is that it is data-driven, which is great, and I support that. I love that. However, you don't always have data for the future. And so as this area is going to experience an increase in density that has not really been seen in this city before, there may not be data that naturally points you towards that area for the projects that you are identifying for the city. So maybe keep in mind that we can't only look backwards, we have to look forwards and anticipate needs which might not be reflected in the data that you're using.
Of course. Yes, thank you.
Additional comments, commissioners, or questions? And so since we can't vote on a specific resolution, we'll have to just kind of get a feel for whether folks agree. But before we do that, there is an opportunity for public comment. Ayana, do we have anyone online who would like to comment on this?
We do not, thank you.
Thank you. And I see no one here in the gallery. Commissioners, are you inclined to say yay or nay with regard to recommending this to the council? Raise your hand for yay. Okay. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Of course, appreciate it.
And commissioners, we will have more on transportation topic, as was mentioned, as we go through the transportation element. We're working hard at a staff level with the consultants that are on the project. And I believe we're involving the Transportation Advisory Committee at this stage. We're working together, working on a schedule for bringing elements and topics for the rest of the year on the comprehensive plan update, with the target of getting to a complete document and a recommendation out of this body by the end of this year. I think we had transportation slotted in late summer right now, but I don't think there's anything firm about that. So it may evolve, but right now I have it penciled in September and October. You around September and October? All right.
I do have, question just in general. So when we come back and talk about this, I guess something that's always been kind of confusing, or I've heard concerns on the priority between multimodal transportation. So I know the cars get the big chunk of everything, but just to maybe better understand how the city looks at prioritizing and where these different kind of tranches go to and the funding, because it kind of looks like it goes into a big pile and then things just kind of happen. But if we could break that out a little bit more towards, what's our goal for, bicycles and scooters, and what's our goal for pedestrians and moving them to bus stops and things like that. I would love to see if there's any thought on that. I assume you guys talk about that, but it's not very transparent down to the level that I'm seeing.
Yeah, we absolutely will. I guess the only thing I'll say is that a lot of the funding sources have a great impact on what we're able to deliver. The city has a small portion of the entire funds that get spent on transportation, or we have control over a small portion of that. So a lot of it is dependent on the granting agencies. But yeah, we'll get into prioritization and everything.
But I think part I agree, and part of that is maybe neighborhoods and communities, if they understood a little bit more, that there may be public-private and maybe community ability to try to access grants above and beyond what you're doing, or to working together. But if there's no transparency and nobody really understands how to get to the understanding of how that works on the city side of the priority, then it's very difficult to do that.
Yep. We'll definitely get into that.
Any final comments, commissioners? Okay, thank you. We will move on to item 5, Middle Housing Implementation, HB 1110.
On the whole time?
Oh, yeah, it was just darkened. I didn't want to give false information about which item we were talking about, so sent it down for that time. All right, we're on part 2 of a 2-part workshop series on middle housing. Gave a lengthy introduction and policy framework last meeting, and we got through a pretty solid set of regulatory topics. We walked through how our existing regulations apply to that topic, what the proposed, or what the state's model ordinance has to say about that particular topic, some staff recommended preliminary options, some other options, and heard some feedback from the Planning Commission. I'm not going to do a recap of the last meeting. I think we'll try to do both of these together, and we'll give a recap at the next meeting of what we heard from the Planning Commission and maybe get some confirmation from you on that. But today we'll finish up the last 3 regulatory topics on that list and then see what time we have to kind of think about it holistically against a set of overarching considerations. That said, the commission had some questions last time about, to paraphrase, what is our goal here? What are we trying to do? So we know that through the state's middle housing law, we need to accommodate middle housing within the city. There are a couple of specific guidelines on that, a couple specific ways that we need to do that, but there is also a lot of city discretion. We have a lot of choices about the specific design standards. We have choices about bulk and dimensions. We have some choices about parking and things like that. So I've got a set, I handed it out to you all. I forgot myself. And these are a lot of words. This represents maybe 5% of the policies and goals in the comprehensive plan. You can see why one of my goals for this periodic update is to slim that down. It is a lot to get through and really internalize. I went through the whole plan and thought of the policies that were most applicable to middle housing. I don't think I want to read all of these. We have them all on the screen here. I think they're important. I guess I will turn to the commission if you would rather we just take 3 or 4 minutes and read this 2-pager, or have me read them all. I would prefer not completely skip it, because I think your predecessors and our predecessors spent a lot of time on these words. The public spent a lot of time on these words, so it's important for us to take a look. So maybe just take a couple of minutes and read through, and I'll slowly advance the slides for folks that are watching online. This first one is Regional Policy Vision 2050. That is what we do have to operate under, and the rest are policies that we can amend through this process.
York, because I think we as commissioners have probably read this before. This looks familiar. I believe I've read
This
it
slide
before.
is, yeah.
But would it be possible to maybe have you just take each section and maybe one that you want to draw attention to, or maybe not even in each section, but maybe a couple that you just want to just raise visibility around specifically?
Sure. So assure a wide range of housing opportunities. I guess the difficulty with that is that we're going to be picking up these policies and amending them in the future. So it's kind of important, I think, to read every word and think of how the tone is, and maybe how long some of them are, and think about ways that we can streamline this and make this easier for future versions of us. But I'll pop through some of the important ones. Assure a wide range of housing opportunities throughout the entire community. Promote increased densities and infill housing types in all residential neighborhoods. So these are some policies that laid the groundwork for middle housing, whether or not the state legislature required it of us. That was a direction that the city was heading, and you remember that Housing Action Plan has actions around that. Again, wide variety of choices, safe and decent housing. And that second policy says about the same thing, wide variety of housing. Promote alternatives to single family and large footprint. That basically says do middle housing. Contribute to the vibrancy and livability of neighborhoods and communities. We want attractive and affordable housing with amenities for households with children. We also want to enable senior citizens to stay in their neighborhood and community with accessible opportunities and services nearby. Households with children, senior citizens, and then also adaptable and appeals to people of all ages and abilities. In the last comprehensive plan, I think this is a 2015 policy. I'm not sure if it was on the books before that, and it may have come in 2018 as well, but protect single-family neighborhoods from substantial changes such as rezoning to multiple family zones, but consider measures to increase capacity through infill housing that protects the character of the neighborhoods. So that says don't make changes, but maybe if you combine that with some of the other policies that kind of say do make changes, it means don't make major changes like rezoning to high density. Depends maybe how you read this, whether this is a policy that would need to change for some of the changes that we're contemplating in this comprehensive plan, middle housing or the low rise, mid rise and the rest. Affordability, increase access to affordability, and the second one, consider a variety of infrastructure funding alternatives to minimize costs to housing. That, to me, says take a hard look at impact fees, frontage improvements, sewer and water connection charges and everything, and make sure that they are, I suppose, the most efficient possible. Something has to give in that. Either we have to lower our standards for the infrastructure, development has to pay for it, the rest of the city has to pay for it. Maybe there's sometimes free money in the form of grants or something, but for the most part, you kind of have to pick one of those. Efficiency, I guess, is the way to accomplish all at the same time, and that's something we certainly work hard on. Reduce the cost of housing, again, with infrastructure and code requirements without compromising safety or community character. And always be thinking of cost implications of regulations and procedures. Incentives for ownership, and consider changes to regulations that provide alternatives for home ownership. We've got that in today's presentation. Serve new residential development by interconnected local streets with bicycle and pedestrian routes, only to the extent feasible. Require design features that are transit, bicycle, and pedestrian friendly, and incorporate physical features to promote alternatives to single occupant vehicle. This is another one that we may need to change as part of this update, something that I'm advocating at least. Ensure that off-street parking continues to be the primary source of parking supply for new development with the city. Our first topic after I'm done with these policies here is parking. In my opinion, I think on-street parking is gonna need to be, if we're gonna be able to meet our housing targets, our employment targets, with the land that we have, I think we're gonna have to make parking very efficient, and one of the most efficient ways to do that is as a shared resource on the public right-of-way. So I think this is one we'll need to take a hard look at. Design neighborhood streets to be compatible with abutting land uses, surely. Urban design, encourage street trees, and that'll come up in our site design work. Enhance the quality of development with design guidelines, standards, and design review. And this is something that's made a little bit more difficult by the new state law that requires only objective design standards, but as long as we craft those objective standards correctly, we can definitely enhance the quality of development. We want to promote infill development in older areas of the city and promote infill development in newer areas of the city. There's a little bit of a qualifier to the second one that incorporates more traditional forms of building and site design. Climate change, reduce lawn areas. Again, site design and landscaping currently, I think just about requires lawn areas in a lot of places. And that was it. That wasn't so bad. Any thoughts about those policies? Again, that's about 1/20th of the policies that there are altogether.
It seems like there's an awful lot of intention with what the previous commission or this commission has wanted to do and what the state wants to do in terms of, you know, build middle housing and do it pretty much everywhere all the time.
Right.
And so I think we should be mindful of that, because if not, I think there's a pretty good opportunity for the state to come in and just say, no, we're gonna do this, and you don't have any input.
I did have a question on the TR, the transportation one, the 2.10 that you said that was something that you were looking at. I guess what was the intent on that? I don't know, I'm reading that and so is that wanting them to all be in the house, or so like bury, like an apartment complex, so you bury them all in the ground? Is that?
I think it's off-street so that you would not approve a development where there was an assumption that the residents or the customers would be using street parking. So make sure that every individual development has enough parking off the street on its property for its uses. And to me, that's wasting a public resource that we already have that is free and can serve multiple uses at the same time, a grand shared parking resource.
Yeah, I guess I was trying to think I mean, that's probably, I agree. I think that's what it meant. I guess in my mind, I'm reading that, I'm thinking, is there making parking go away on streets, I guess. Maybe I'm thinking of that backwards, but.
Right.
So like, you know, like
we do
turn
have
it
a
into more
different
walking space
policy
and-
that says that maintain on-street parking, so we kind of have it both. That leads to a lot of parking.
Gotcha.
We'll, in the couple slides from now, the number of parking stalls required per dwelling unit times the number of dwelling units in our growth target, 39,000 times 2 or 3, 80 to 120,000 parking stalls. And what did I hear yesterday? Underground was 80,000 a stall?
Easily.
So 80,000 times 80,000 minimum. No, doesn't have to be all underground, but it's not that much cheaper to be under building or surface parking. Okay, back to the last 3 topics, and right on cue, here is parking, and here is our existing regulations for residential parking. This is outside of Metro Everett. There are some different regulations within Metro Everett, but there are no middle housing within Metro Everett, so we're focusing on the rest of the city. 1 to 4 unit dwellings or projects require 2 per unit or 3 where the access is from an easement drive. 5+ units kicks you into the multifamily parking section, and that requires a different number of parking stalls depending on the number of bedrooms. 1 to 2 stalls per unit for multifamily, and there are a number of parking reduction options in code. There are kind of standard or by right reductions if you have senior, low income. Is it transit adjacencies automatic, 10% or something?
Not automatic,
No, okay, so just those 2, senior and low income is automatic. And then you can also do a parking study that done by a professional transportation planner that can justify lower parking standards. And I think it's pretty frequent that we get some reductions off these baseline numbers. Shared parking is also a route to reduce if you have a mixed-use development where maybe during the day there's businesses that can share the same stall with evening and nighttime parking for the residents. So those are the existing requirements. The state's model ordinance implements some of those requirements that do reduce our room to maneuver on parking that have a maximum. And I think what this is exactly what the state law is. So maximum of 2 off-street spaces per unit. Sorry, I'm starting from the bottom. 2 off-street spaces per unit on lots greater than 6,000 and 1 off-street space per unit on lots smaller than 6,000. And I just looked at this the other day. The cleanup bill from this year's legislature made 6,000 even. It was no greater than 6,000. 6,000. So I think 6,000 is 1 off-street space.
To follow up on your dollar amount for parking spaces, that's 147 acres in just parking spaces. that
Right.
we would need. That's not even travel lanes, that's just parking spaces.
And that's just residential.
Yeah.
And then throw in another set for
Yeah.
commercial, which is why in the housing action plan, it says, take a look at our parking maximums. No off-street parking is allowed to be required within a half-mile walking distance of major transit stop. That is bus rapid transit and light rail, or rail, so near Everett Station or the Swift stations on Evergreen Way or the pending Swift stations on Broadway. I think planned stations count. So two options under consideration here. One is a relatively simple one that would just take the multifamily parking standards that had a basis in analysis and review when it was adopted. If it works for an apartment building, it would seem to work for a triplex. So that would be a relatively simple way to do this. Another one is a more flat one space per unit. That's lower than the multifamily parking standards. Not sure what level of analysis we would need to do to justify such a change. Seems like a little bit less with the multifamily one because the analysis has already been done. So those are two options for consideration. There are, of course, more out there.
Is there anything stopping us from just outright eliminating parking minimums?
Nothing external that I know of, no. I believe we would need to justify it with analysis. That would be about it. And so capacity to undertake a parking study that would satisfy, I guess, the city council ultimately. That would be a bit of a challenge.
And a follow-up question to that, in the Rethink Housing Action Plan, I recall there, I think you just mentioned it, one of the, not plan, calls to action, but one of the recommendations was to have you guys, or us, or I forgot if it specified who exactly, but someone to look at either significantly reducing, or I want to say it said outright eliminate, but I'm not remembering the exact text.
It didn't say eliminate, but it did say, I'll pull up the exact recommendation here. Study opportunities for reducing parking minimums in areas where more diverse housing types are encouraged. And there's a little bit more context in there. In addition to reviewing broader flexibility with zoning and development regulations in largely single-family neighborhoods, the city should also consider lowering the parking requirements for some unit types, especially those within transit overlays. These adjustments should be informed by a targeted parking study to evaluate how current and future requirements should be tailored to meet projected parking needs.
Thanks for finding that.
Yeah. There are definitely other jurisdictions around the country. I'm not sure how many in Washington. Did I hear the state of Minnesota?
State of Minnesota.
The entire state of Minnesota has preempted parking minimums. While normally I think it's important to analyze changes that we make, I'm not sure how much analysis, what the value would be. There's definitely implications to reducing parking. I think in general, the way that I think about on-street parking is that there's no such thing as not having parking. It's just a matter of going around the block, and if there's a particular heavy parking demand more than the street can supply for that particular area. And then, of course, everybody has the option of having their own parking spot if they don't want to deal with parking on the street. The state has made parking not part of the environment with respect to State Environmental Policy Act, SEPA. So that means that it's not something that is supposed to factor heavily in environmental review at the programmatic plan level or at the project level.
Are there cities in Washington that have already, or maybe previously, realigned their parking standards in a way that complies with the middle housing bill? And what do their minimums look like?
Seattle has cut down their parking minimums to almost zero.
So we can take a look at that, because this will come up again for the rest of development as well.
Additional questions, commissioners?
Yeah, I just had, I mean, not, I guess related to parking, sort of related to parking. If we reduce parking to zero, is there a method by which we can still, like mandate for larger developments, a place for either, my voice, delivery and like move in, move out? Like, parking a U-Haul or a delivery van in the street is kind of a pain for not just the residents, but for traffic safety and on all sorts of things. And being able to say, hey, you want to put 40 units here, great. We've got to have a place to park a couple of 26-foot box trucks. Those would be the only 2 parking spaces you have, but we got to have that, or something similar to those, that effect.
Certainly, yeah, we manage our on-street curb space continually. Public Works manages that and finds loading spaces, but I think it's a good concept, especially in a large area, to go off-street or provide some options off-street, especially if there's going to be heavy delivery demand at a place, which seems like just about every place these days.
Would it be possible with regards to the either reducing parking minimums to 1 space per dwelling unit or just outright eliminating, of getting some level of or some idea of the impact that would have on housing prices? I remember when we were doing the Rethink Housing plan and we talked about parking minimums, I remember there being a bunch of statistics around having lower parking minimums meant how housing construction was cheaper.
Yeah, I think definitely structured parking is expensive. The $80,000 is for underground, underbuilding parking. There's a figure for how much it costs for surface parking as well. I think how it manifests itself for the most part in the middle housing realm is through a reduction in the number of units. So it's not necessarily going to make the unit that is there more or less expensive. It's going to mean that you will only fit 4 units instead of 5 or 2 instead of 3. That has an impact on housing affordability overall by crimping capacity. But we can find what the latest figures are for a patch of ground that's paved with its driveway.
Yeah, and I would love to the other data point you were talking about, I would love to see more information about that and exactly how would, say, reducing parking minimums to 1 space, like how would that help impact positively or probably not negatively our housing goals?
Right. Sure. And Kelsey, anything from debating parking with development day in and day out?
All the time. Nobody wants to provide these minimum parking counts. Doesn't matter what type of development it is. Nobody wants to. The other thing that we've heard back from developers too, though, is, they have their own figures and data that they're using. And so there's certain counts that even if we were, I would say, to decide that we're not going to require parking for any of these units, they often will work that into their programs anyway, in their development anyway, because they often will charge for those spaces and they know they can charge for it. So there's a lot of that work that they're already doing on their end on the private side to already assess that, regardless of what our minimum counts are. But yeah.
And even if we were to put it at one space per dwelling unit, that's not stopping someone from developing a house that has 5 spaces, right?
Correct. Under current code, there's no set maximum count. So the key thing would be making sure that, we want certain development standards still in place, things like our driveway, max width and things like that. We can still retain that information to kind of help how that design ultimately works on a site. But right now, there's no maximum count.
So if the market is demanding parking and developers, their data comes probably more directly from the immediate market. So if the market is demanding parking for particular structures in order for them to be attractive to buyers, then presumably that's being built into developers' designs. And so with that in mind, that to some extent, this will be market-driven if we take our hands off of it, I would support reducing. I don't know if I would be ready to go to zero, because we do have the reality of the fact that if folks are still car dependent, we still don't have a comprehensive transit system that works for a lot of folks. But it's like the chicken and egg. What do you do first? How do you attract the capital to build out that comprehensive system if you don't have users? And how do you get users if everything is driven by car dependency, meaning users of the transit system?
I will say that I think looking at, I mean, even potentially just outright eliminating the parking minimums, I would much rather have a parking crisis than a housing crisis.
Cannot argue with that, Commissioner Atkins. Additional comments, questions, commissioners?
But I think it's a great point to remember that we're just taking away the mandate. The developers, the builders, the public, if they're wanting to buy communities and live in areas that require more parking, they're willing to do that. But if you don't do this and you don't allow, you're cutting out places that maybe have that don't meet the 1 mile to maybe have a mother-in-law or somebody that doesn't drive, or, there's a whole bunch of situations that already exist. And then we're also trying to make options for people that want to incorporate that lifestyle. So, I would be supportive of a zero, or reducing, eliminating the mandated. And I think I see more and more cities across the country on some of the apps that I'm watching that are continuing to go and eliminate parking mandates. Again, people think they're taking the parking away. They still can have the parking. It's just they're required to have a certain minimum amount.
And I think it's really important that we keep in mind too that, 25% of Washington state residents don't drive. And if someone knows a better figure, please let me know. But I think I recall seeing it was 25%. But it just goes to this larger point that, like, there's so many young people that I know, people my age, would prefer not to drive. It's costly. You're having to pay for the parking space, you're having to pay for car insurance, you're having to pay for the car, so on and so forth. Gas is so expensive. And I think it feels almost kind of patronizing to assume that everyone that is going to be having an apartment or a house here in Everett needs a car, and that renters aren't capable of looking and assessing a particular unit and whether or not it fits their parking needs. So I just see this very much as just giving both our renters and residents more choice, as well as giving developers more choice and being able to create unique structures. And maybe they want to make a bicycle oriented housing development. Wouldn't that be really interesting of idea? Sorry, I'm rambling by this point, but.
And there are, I think Alice Ann's been collecting other cities' middle housing ordinances and approaches, and there are, was it Vancouver, BC had some pretty strong bicycle parking requirements for middle housing. Some other cities do as well. We require bicycle parking for multifamily only, I believe, and commercial development. So triplex and below would not have it required, although presumably you have not hard to find space for a bicycle and those types. And I do have an answer for Commissioner Atkins. In the city of Everett, this is households, not population. 8% have no vehicle available. That's 3,700 households. 41% have one vehicle available. So between the two, half of the households in Everett have 1 or 0 vehicles available, yet we require 2 per, in most cases, at least for these single family and middle housing.
Just out of curiosity, I don't know if you have these numbers available right at hand, but I'd be curious about our employment rate, like our overall employment rate, not the, not like including seniors and children and just like what percentage of Everett is actually going to work every day. And then in addition to that, also curious about the percentage of renters.
The percentage of households that are renters?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll get those. I don't think I can grab them that quickly. Well, renters is 24,600 households out of 45,000 in the city, so maybe 55%. $54.5. Okay, I think that helps. We will probably turn back to this. This is one of those, I'm not sure if it's land use, transportation, a little bit of both, I think. We're thinking of bringing land use and housing elements, so bigger than middle housing and covering the whole city in the next couple of meetings. So we'll probably need to talk a little bit more about parking there and then also with the transportation element.
I suspect when our other commissioners join us at a future meeting, they will want to weigh in on this as well. Any further on that topic, commissioners? No? Okay.
Okay, so the next three topics are kind of all one thing. It's streetscapes and frontage, site design, public frontage improvements, and design standards. This is, streetscapes is what you see from the street. Some of it has to do with the aesthetics of it. Some of it has to do with the performance of it. Site design is, next, I'll pop here. Site design is, a lot of the guidance materials focus on single lot development, kind of like a typical 6,000 or so square foot city lot that has a house on it, and how could you reconfigure that for middle housing, maybe a bigger lot, maybe a smaller one. We have a lot of parcels in the city that are quite a bit bigger than that, but not quite to the full-on subdivision size. They're in the half acre to 1 acre size. The kind of development that on the right is a short plat in southeast Everett, I think it was. That was about 0.55 acres. It's not the kind of thing where in most of these images, you're gonna have a front of a house and then parking behind or something like that. It's gonna take some level of site design, maybe interior circulation. Not everything is gonna orient to the public right of way. There's gonna be an access drive, a central courtyard, something like that. We have a whole series of regulations that interrelate on that, and I had a hard time trying to distill how to do site design in a middle housing world and how we regulate that. We have land division regulations, 4 chapters of them in city code. We have minimum lot standards, width, depth, size. We have regulations for easement drives, for parking location, and all of those kind of go together, and a developer will make a proposal and we review it against all of those provisions for access and utilities and setbacks and all of that, and then you get a short plat or a subdivision. Or you may not even need to do that. You can do condominium or rentals with multiple units. Currently, it would have to meet the minimum density standard, maximum density standard, excuse me. So lots of different pathways here. I think it's a little easier to wrap your mind around the one lot, especially if it has an alley on it. A little bit harder to wrap our minds around this one. We have a series of requirements that apply to certain types of development, and this kind of covers some of the topics that are coming along afterwards here. Public frontage requirements apply to certain types of developments and not to others. We have a section on front porch and entry in 19.08 chapter. We have design standards. We have regulations limiting where garages can be, and we have requirements for private open space for development. Each of those apply to different types of residential development, and this is all applicable to the current single-family zones, RS, R1, R2, and R2A. It doesn't, we don't have a lot of regulations for a fourplex in those zones because they're not allowed. But duplexes are in some cases, and townhouses, which are usually going to manifest themselves as something like a duplex in these zones, are also allowed in some cases.
I have questions about this. Is now
Fantastic.
the time
Yes.
for questions?
Yes.
So first, what was do you know what the thought of having, or rather, I guess, 3 questions. First, so looking at the graph right, or chart, so a front porch and a garage are required for a detached house on a small lot, but not on a lot over 4,500 square feet. Why?
I think there were a couple of principles in play. And some of those were regulate a single-family house as less, regulate middle housing and small lots more, because there's tighter spacing between buildings, so maybe there's a need for more care in design, whereas a larger lot, single-family, presumably you don't see it as much, or there was just a concept of kind of property rights, but that didn't extend much past a detached single-family dwelling unit. They're guesses.
And then I guess the second half of my questions is, so reading this, for detached homes, there are no design standards.
Design standards isn't a precise term, so it's like, what is a design standard and what is not a design standard? I'd hesitate to say there are no design standards, but we have a section called design standards, which has some pretty specific things about transparency and facades and all that do not apply. Kelsey, can you think of what could be considered a design standard that applies to houses?
Well, I guess I would add to that, I mean, in terms of like a porch, for instance, just to continue that train of thought, it's not required outright for a single-family residence. However, when you look at the table, it does talk about any single-family residence that might have a front or side or street side setback exception. So oftentimes people will have their porch encroach into the required front setback. Those design standards do apply. And more often than not, when we see new single-family residences, because they're constructing that building right at that 20-foot lot line, they're gonna have their entrance encroach into that front setback, which then does trigger those requirements. So it's kind of a weird situation, and it does kind of seem in a way like just require it outright. But I would say more often than not, we're seeing it required anyway. So that's kind of the same situation, I think, for a lot of these design standards, including even the garage requirements, with how they kick in to play.
Yeah, because it just seems strange to me that it feels like these like the design standards, I'm guessing, were meant to try to keep neighborhood character, to preserve neighborhood character, but I mean, what's stopping me from going out and building the ugliest possible detached single-family home that's on a lot over 4,500 square feet?
I'm just wondering what disasters have ensued because we have not regulated detached houses on a lot over 4,500 square feet in the same way that we have regulated them on smaller lots.
Especially that garage part, I don't understand the.
Because setbacks apply. So is this a matter of just defining the setbacks?
So could you explain the setback exceptions? What constitutes a setback exception? I wasn't clear on that myself.
So we have, it's in chapter 6. It's a table that basically outlines various exceptions to the setback standards. So more often than not, we have setback requirements for a principal structure. So usually for a residential, it's gonna be 20 feet front and rear, 5 feet for their side, 10 feet for a side yard, or street side yard. There are certain provisions for certain types of construction that are allowed to be within those principal setback areas. Porches, for instance, are a main one. Porches, decks, depending on how they're designed and what they actually look like, how tall they are, things like that, they are allowed to be within the principal structures setback to a certain extent. There's other things too, things like rockeries and retaining walls are called out, heat pumps, those types of items are called out in that exception table as well.
What was that code, 19?
It's in 1906.
1906-030, and fences is in there too. So if you have a fence within 20 feet of your front lot line, then you trigger garage requirements?
Don't ask me that.
Rhetorical question.
Actually, it says, well, it does say any residential dwelling provided it, so I wouldn't necessarily consider the fence to be.
Yeah, that's the fun that we get, that Kelsey's team gets to do, interpreting things to the
You're trying to
incredible
break my
variety of
brain with that
development
question.
types, yeah.
No, go ahead, Commissioner Atkins.
I was just wanting to make sure this wasn't covered elsewhere. Evan, how does this chart with the design standards for 2 units and 3 units, but not the detached homes? How does that interact with HB 1112? And I'm pretty sure that has a requirement around you can't have design standards for single family homes if you yeah.
Yes, you were almost there exactly. Yes, we cannot have differential standards for single family and for middle housing. If it's required for middle housing, it must be required for single family. So for everything on this list, I guess we have a simple choice, which is to make it apply to all development or make it apply to no development, not no development and all, but you get what I mean, single family and middle housing. Or the third way is to review, revise, and tailor. But whatever we wind up with, there can be no more restrictive requirements for middle housing than there are for single family. I believe, actually, that you could potentially have more restrictive requirements for single family than middle housing.
If we went down the review, revise, and tailor path, that has to be done by the end of the year?
Something needs to be done roughly by the end of the year.
Okay.
Our comprehensive plan periodic update deadline is December 31st. I think I've said that we're likely to be a little bit late for that. We're thinking the first couple of months. I'm hoping to get this planning commission done with their work by the end of the year, and then we'll see how long it takes the city council to complete their review of the full package. The middle housing law formally takes effect in June 1st or 31st or 30th of next year, June 31st of 2025. At that point, if we haven't adopted middle housing regulations, let's say we finish our periodic update but not something on the middle housing law, then the state's model ordinance takes over.
And is there preemption all or nothing? Or is it, so like if we skipped this portion of it or similar, this is the only portion that wouldn't apply?
I'm not sure. I'll have to look into that. We also have the option of doing something relatively simple to meet the law on time and then continue it. I mean, no matter what, I think we're going to continue to work on this. We'll see actual development. We'll see things that we like that we didn't anticipate, and we'll continue to address it. But we could do something simple like, and this is just hypothetical, make everything on this list apply to all development and then continue to work on it over the coming years is an option. So we've got a couple more kind of, oh, yeah.
From the, trying to ask this question on the last meeting, but I mean, from the, part of this is, part of the cost in doing the missing middle is the time of it takes for projects to be approved.
Yeah.
Whether it's just an outright expense or it's a a financing issue, whether a bank trusts it and things like that. So I mean, trying to make it as simple. From that aspect of it, if you were to make every, design standards apply to all missing middle, wouldn't that significantly increase staff time and the amount of staff you would need to review that without making your reviews go even longer?
I appreciate the prompts on things that I was going to mention in my remarks but didn't. The other new requirement is that all of these design standards need to be objective. We've been trying to pull out subjective design standards for years now from our code because it's difficult for staff to administer. Now that is state law and something that has a requirement that it be compatible. We were just talking about this in a land use team meeting today where we've had instances where we took a poll of everybody in the room who thinks this is compatible with that, and it was a 50-50 split. And so that's a perfect example of something that's obviously not objective if two people can come at the exact opposite conclusion to it. So there are some, when we run through the design standards specifically, that have like make this unit compatible with the other unit or the roof form compatible with the other one. We'll have to strip all of that out. It will need to be objective so that a developer can look at their own plan and look at our code and know that this is a workable design. That should reduce the staff complexity of staff review. The more that we do to make it crystal clear, staff will still need to compare the designs to our code, but hopefully through this effort, we will reduce that staff review time.
Commissioner Atkins.
I'm sorry, but I have so many questions about this. So also, I didn't realize, so there's no design standards required for dwellings in historic overlay zones?
That's kind of a not accurate. The design standards in 1908-040 do not apply to the historic overlay zone. Each historic overlay zone has its own design standards under a separate chapter. Thank you. I should have noted that.
And then if we just got rid of design standards overall, as we covered last year, there would still be like safety standards and whatnot. It's just that we wouldn't necessarily control the look, the aesthetic of individual buildings.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
So that kind of brings me to my point, my thought at the moment, which is, it seems like we're saying, okay, there were no standards attached to detached houses on lot sizes above 4,500 square feet, and there were these other ones for smaller parcels. And so the thought is to take the regulations that apply to the smaller parcels and extend that to the larger parcels. Why are we not thinking to extend the lack of regulation on the larger parcels to the smaller parcels? And I would ask folks to consider why there was that differential. And I think if we look at some of the issues around disparate impact to working class folks and folks of various different racial identities who presumably were locked into lower levels of the economic system, where they were more likely to have smaller parcels and therefore were subject to greater oversight over what they could do on those parcels versus what folks who may have had more access to resources, larger parcels, who were just kind of trusted to do what was best for their family, their community, for their property and their right to develop their property as private property owners. They were trusted, whereas folks who were more likely to have fewer resources and therefore smaller parcels were not trusted. And I think that if you look at the maps, you actually included some language about this in the memo that was sent to us, the study that the UW did. So if anyone's ever looked at the maps for Everett, there's a very clear pattern of where some of the really exclusionary types of zoning practices, or I guess these were on titles, some of the exclusionary practices, the racial covenants, those would be on the parcels that were not regulated. If you look at the map of the areas, the Northwest neighborhood, for example, pretty much everything north of 9th there were racially exclusive covenants. If you look at the Delta neighborhood, near 19th between Cedar and Walnut, View Ridge Madison, huge portions of that area had racially restrictive covenants. And so if you look at lot sizes in areas that had those restrictive covenants versus lot sizes in other areas, I'm wondering if there's a correlation between who was trusted to develop their property appropriately and who wasn't. And should we continue to distrust folks who don't have the resources to secure those larger parcels simply because they don't have the resources to secure those larger parcels? And should we extend those regulations to those who do have the resources? We did not see a disaster when folks with larger parcels were trusted to have more say over how they developed. So.
And following on to your points, it feels like it's almost intended to make it harder for working class and low income homeowners to actually be able to build a home on that lot. I mean, if you're someone that has a lot that's smaller than 4,500 square feet, presumably you don't have nearly as much money as someone who has a lot that's larger. And so maybe having to have that front porch and garage built for your unit may actually prohibit you from being able to afford to build a structure on that lot in the first place.
Good way of thinking about it and good perspectives. As to why we've got the design guidelines, I think you may be onto some aspect of the motives in there. We have the comprehensive plan policies that we went through, and there are some that are about pedestrian orientation. There are some that are about quality design, eye of the beholder. There are some that are about maintaining the character that is there, regardless of good or bad, just being consistent with it. And so those were some of the goals for some of these design standards. I'm not sure how much history there is in these 1908, how far back that goes. I don't know if this was present in the 80s or if this was rethink zoning or not much earlier.
If it was at all possible to find out just like the original reasoning behind that 45 square foot lot, like it just really strikes me as odd that you would require a front porch and garage for a detached house on a smaller lot than on a bigger house on a bigger lot.
My guess, I'm sorry if I said this already, is that we didn't used to allow those things at all before. You cannot build a small lot, single family, you cannot build a duplex. And so when we opened up some of these zones to those kind of entry-level middle housing, that we brought design standards to smooth the new housing types into their new homes.
I think I agree with Yorick in the fact that, yes, it was because it was smaller lot, but I think there was definitely probably some pre-existing ideas that we don't want them parking in the front yard. If it's a small lot, that's where they're gonna end up parking, and we're gonna have a mud front yard or something to that effect. So if we require the garage, there is going to be off-street parking or whatever. So I think that there probably were some exclusionary reins in there, because zoning has been exclusionary. I mean, all of zoning has been exclusionary. And one of the requirements that we are mandated under state law right now is to look at all of our changes with an equity lens. And I can understand where you're thinking that not having requirements, but at the same time, if we are putting a lot more density in, and we've got a neighborhood that's already a little bit nervous to eliminate design requirements, I think we're gonna end up in a conflict zone one way or another. And I'm not saying that either one is right, I'm just saying that I think we may end up in a conflict zone.
Can I add one point of clarification? We don't require garages. So if you provide a garage, you have to meet those standards. We don't require covered parking though. So right now we have a lot of parking requirements where it has to be on site. You're not supposed to utilize off-street or on-street parking, gotta mix that up, to count for your minimum requirements, but we would allow for, durable surface parking to count for that requirement on site. So if you are providing a garage, you're electing provide a garage on your site, you have to meet these standards if you meet a table.
So if I had a lot that was like, say, 3,500 square feet, I build a house on it, and throw down some gravel to park a car, would that be?
Not gravel, no, but,
Or
but.
whatever
a
the
durable-
cheapest option of
Quote
it.
unquote durable surface as determined by Public Works. Yes, that would be okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And I don't have the ability to put it up on the screen, but in your packets on page 10 are exactly what those garage requirements are. Need to access the garage from the alley if possible.
If they're building one.
If they're building, all of this, if they're building one. Except along alleys, all garage wall facades facing the street shall be set back a minimum of 5 feet behind the front wall of the primary building mass. The state's model ordinance has a similar way of dealing with it where there's a setback of, I think it was 10 feet maybe for the principal structure and 15 feet for any garage. So the same thing, that basically you've got the front door is a little bit more prominent in the street than the garage is. That was other than pedestrian orientation, character, and quality, I would say having a sense of community in the streetscape is probably another goal of these design requirements. And then the third requirement for garages, if you have them, the third out of 4, is the length, maybe up to 50% of the length of the street-facing dwelling unit facade. So this is not having the majority of what you see of a house being a garage door. And then a limitation on how wide
So
narrow lots.
are we trying through those, especially those last two, are we trying to prevent like those kinds of suburban homes where the first floor is mostly just a garage and then you have like a little doorway to then go upstairs and you have the rest of the house?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Why?
Some of it is visual appeal. I
To
think some
whom?
of it is,
But who determines visual appeal?
well, the community, the council, the planning commission and staff have over the 100+ years of the city, right or wrong. I think there's an important aspect of one of the core principles of planning is community building. And I mentioned that this is the city's primary public realm, and I think that's important. The majority of the public open space, even if it's mainly roads and parking, is the public right-of-way, and that's where you meet your neighbors. Having incentives for porches, prominent entries that aren't garages, I think you may have, if a development, if a dwelling unit is kind of nothing but a garage, then maybe you're likely to drive the car into it, the door closes behind it, you never meet your neighbors. That is maybe unfortunate, that is maybe not good for civic health, and there is some reason for that. And I think that gets into a lot of our design standards, from the big zones to the little zones.
So I mentioned this before. I live in the riverfront townhomes where at street level, many of the units, it's just a garage with that doorway on the side. Do you guys know how this applies to those townhomes?
Those townhomes would have been regulated under a planned development overlay and in a different zone. I'm not sure what the underlying zone was, not one that we have on the books now when it was permitted.
Wasn't that a big part of that was for flooding?
Could have been for flooding too, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that your habitable space is not in the floodplain. You're above, so it was a way of, instead of elevating it, they could put the uninhabitable space down there.
Now, I think you're raised above the floodplain, but that is a really common feature in.
Yeah, it's methane.
Right, yeah.
I don't know if there's methane at the townhomes too, is there?
Yeah, we
Okay.
had there was some sort of agreement we had to sign
Yeah,
that
okay.
acknowledged there was methane
Okay,
underneath us.
I know in the central riverfront, which was the landfill pad, tire fire site and all of that, I know has those interesting things underground.
So, but that's a very attractive development, and that's exactly something that would be prevented through these types of measures. And so that's, I guess, the piece that's interesting to me is the design standards may appear objective on their face, but they are rooted in subjective perspectives, like the fact that we shouldn't have garages take up a major part of the front of a structure. So I guess that's what I'm struggling with. I think that objective standards can be very useful. They can help create community cohesive atmospheres and the like. But there are also a lot of examples that would be in violation that are wonderful community spaces. And also, I know that we haven't applied these to the larger parcels. We have not applied these before. So to say now we're just going to apply it to everyone and go forward that way, that seems like a disservice to the creativity of property owners and developers that have had the freedom to develop and have developed in really wonderful ways. I don't know. I'm questioning the utility of expanding these types of things when we know that there are objective standards like the setbacks, like the health and safety requirements around the development. And also a lot of the assumptions about what's good or what's bad, what's attractive, what isn't. A lot of those assumptions developed over time when huge portions of our community were not at the decision-making table. And they just kind of exist as a norm, but they're really not. They're really reflective of the subjective perspectives of a segment of the population that had access to those decision-making spaces in the past.
Shall we go through a couple more on these? We've got some slides on these. It's all the same topics here, but we've got, I guess, some examples of site design. I showed these maybe a year or two ago. These are all at the same scale, and these are all different neighborhoods in Everett. Yellow is public right-of-way. That brighter yellow is easements of various types. Gray is buildings, and then you see the lot lines in there. So I'll just kind of scroll through these. This is an example where you see some of those very deep lots where you're going to tend to have the easement drives and sideways orientation rather than directly oriented to the public street. Like I said, all same scale, North Everett. Easement drive land. Topography. So I mentioned these kind of site design factors, and we're talking through some of these options. I'll just skip through. This is specific to the site design aspects of 040, but there's others that we'll talk about next. I don't want to mention the second one, which is, I think we've talked about this a little bit in the past. There's a lot of things that you can do currently as a condo or as rentals, multiple units on the same lot, that you cannot do for ownership product other than through condominium. So our lot standards, minimum lot size, width and depth, unless you're doing a unit lot land division, can make it difficult to say sell an accessory dwelling unit now or one unit of a triplex in the future on certain lot sizes. I think staff is interested in achieving some sort of parity. If you can build it as a condo, if you can build it as a rental, you should be able to build it as a fee simple ownership. We're hearing a lot from the development community that that's a strong preference of buyers to have fee simple ownership, which means you own the lot up to the sky and everything associated with it. Yeah, so I'll just, that is a complicated one because we have multiple sections, chapters on land division that interact with state law on it as well, but that's something we're trying to sort out to promote home ownership.
And is that, I'm sorry, so you're pulling it out like it's not tonight, or you're pulling it out like not in the comp plan for this round?
Pulling, I don't remember what I said pulling it out about. We will try to do it as part of this comp plan update.
And it's scheduled, I mean, you've got it in there, whether you get to it or not, I understand, but
We've
I mean,
got it in
the
there.
intention is to try to create some kind of unit lot subdivision or unit lot
Correct.
comparable to a condominium act.
Correct. And it just is gonna take the staff review to feel comfortable that we're meeting all of the requirements of state subdivision law and all of the intent of it. Anything to add there?
May also take a title attorney or two.
Yeah, yeah. But yes, that's our intention. We've heard loud and clear from, I think, this planning commission, definitely the city council and the mayor. Homeownership is something that we really want to promote, and homeownership of small parcels and units is gonna be the more achievable starter entry point, which is really in short supply right now. And I have not heard a lot of disagreement on that in principle, so I think it's more about getting it technically correct than a big debate about it, I think. Public frontage improvement, this gets into kind of infrastructure considerations. Right now, if you build 3 or more dwellings, and that can be attached or not attached, you must build frontage improvements. Typically, that's sidewalk, planter strip, street trees. If the road itself is substandard in any way, that's probably not gonna come up much with middle housing, but you would need to improve that as well in the alley. In the sidewalk priority area, that's in blue on the map there, and this was then all dwellings must build at least a safe walking path. So our typical frontage improvement includes a concrete sidewalk and curb and gutter. A safe walking path could be an asphalt path that would be in the same place that the concrete sidewalk would be. Lower cost, lower durability, lower street appeal, and higher chance that someone will park on it or it will get covered with gravel and lost to time. But saves quite a bit of money for smaller housing developments that may not be able to support it. I'd say frontage improvements is another one, like parking, that developers are rarely thrilled about being saddled with as part of that development. But not having sidewalks, also not very popular in this city. Accessory dwelling units, I don't think ever trigger frontage improvements or safe walking paths. Here's an example of a development that is in progress right now. Kind of tough to see the dashed line around what is currently a single house on a fairly large parcel with a detached garage. This is a short plat for 4 single-family houses, and the frontage improvements, zooming in this case, are like that. So you can see it does connect to a sidewalk existing on the left side. On the right side, there's still no sidewalk, so it ends in a little hook that sends you into the street, I suppose. So that's what they look like. Our consultants and public works staff and planning staff are looking at our sidewalk prioritization area, sidewalk priority area. It was established based on proximity to parks, schools, transit, and maybe some other considerations. I think this was a new one in Rethink Zoning in 2020. So we're looking at, is the blue in the right place? And then we'll need to also think about what does it mean. Big tension here, I think, between a really substantial cost to housing. The smaller the development, the fewer the number of units, the bigger of a proportion of the development that's going to be these frontage improvements. but I think very consistently ranked extremely high among the public of frustrations where there is missing sidewalks and a strong desire to see those sidewalk networks be completed. I think we more or less rely on development to build the sidewalks on our local street network. We don't have a really well-funded program currently to build out those sidewalks. Where we do build sidewalks, not through development, is gonna be things like connecting arterials, gaps, connecting major pedestrian generators. We've got a project grant funded with Sound Transit to improve the pedestrian path from downtown to Everett Station, for example. But the sidewalks on local streets are a little bit more difficult for the city to fund. There's a big gap and it would be very costly, so we turn to development. So can stick with where we're at. We can make more, just go towards the sidewalk side. We can go towards the affordability side.
I would imagine that to have each individual property owner build a segment of sidewalks is building sidewalks at the most expensive price point. The absolutely most costly way you can build a sidewalk is by doing it that way. Has the city considered a sidewalk-specific impact fee that goes into a general fund that funds building of sidewalks at a scale that provides a reasonable cost savings to folks in the community?
I think that's a great concept. It's one that I've thought of as well. Something like you could build the sidewalk, or you would have a fee in lieu of building the sidewalk that is nearly the cost of it, maybe a little bit less, so there's an incentive to do that. And then that goes into a fund, and maybe when you've collected the fee in lieu from half the block or a third of the block, the city chips in the rest and finishes the entire block. There are some legal and I don't know if there's technical hurdles. I guess legal hurdles are technical hurdles. With our most fee in lieu programs, you need to spend it within a certain amount of time or give it back. How long is it going to be before you get a critical mass on that block to actually build the sidewalk? Or are we going to be collecting fee in lieu and then refunding it within 5 years frequently? Do we have the legal authority to hold on to that for longer? Can we share it more widely through the city, but then you get one block that has contributed money and didn't see a sidewalk potentially for decades? I think we just need to figure out some of those things, and I think that would be an elegant solution that would be much more efficient. We could also rely more on just the city to fund it. That's going to take tax revenue from existing residents, which is not going to be popular. We can reduce the standards, so you can see some, we can say, we don't need the perfect, long-lasting sidewalk that's gonna be here 3 generations from now. Right now, all we can do is that safe walking path. I'm not sure how durable those are and if that's cost-effective to spend money on it now, and you're gonna need to deal with it again sooner, and it may not actually be completely safe, but that's always an option with all of these, is to lower our standards and improve affordability. This is a tough one.
Commissioners, I know you probably, like me, hear from folks in the community on the issue of sidewalks. Thoughts on this?
Well, as a developer, a fee in lieu would be a great option. I mean, usually it's usually not the sidewalk specific that's the greatest cost. It's usually the power pole that's in the way and the utilities that have to be rerouted. And so just doing it for this little tiny section, you just set it up for the next guy to have to repay and double the, or if you could actually do it more in a chunk.
Right.
So fee in lieu is a great idea, I think.
And drainage, I think, is a really big one too. Just again, to show what that might look like.
Yeah, I also agree with fee in lieu. I mean, I've just consistently heard people talking about the lack of sidewalks, and I think especially in some of our poorer neighborhoods, the lack of sidewalks kind of becomes, it helps, or I shouldn't say help, it negatively affects the reputation of these neighborhoods. And I think further reinforces the idea that these are poor neighborhoods. And I think figuring out how we can make sure that we're getting sidewalks is really important. I mean, from a pedestrian safety standpoint, never mind all the other benefits I think that it would have for a given neighborhood.
And I'm remiss in not having a map that shows where we do and don't have sidewalks right now, but north and south is the simple version of that. Okay, and then the design standards, we already talked quite a bit about this, but here's the list of what those design standards are that currently apply to a subset of residential development in the single-family zones, orient to the streetscape and to the internal residential environment, have unified open space and pedestrian pathways, parking less prominent, and pedestrian emphasis to the design. Those two feel very subjective to me, so we're gonna need to do something with that regardless. Vehicles and parking from the alley if available. We do have a specific amendment request, if you remember back about a year, is the Cunningham request that is to tighten the alley access requirements and reduce the exceptions that we have in code for alley access. Really pushing hard not to add curb cuts to otherwise potentially uninterrupted blocks, or even if they are interrupted, reduce the number of curb cuts there. Limit one street access per 2 dwellings, so if you have a duplex, you need to have a consolidated driveway. Facades distinct and different from each other in attached housing, but with unifying compositional elements, very subjective again. You need to pick 2 of 4, 3 or other per director architectural treatments. Must provide vertical modulation. The roof form must complement neighboring properties. There must be certain architectural elements in the roof forms. 10 feet separation between buildings. That is not a fire code. That is a design requirement that seeks to make for more usable open space within a development. No exterior stairs visible from the street, and then 15% of street-facing facade windows must, 15% of the street-facing facade must be windows or main entrance doors. So I think we were leaning more towards keeping and expanding at least some of the design standards. The review, all of the subjective ones are gonna have to go or be very strictly defined in an objective manner. I think we were looking towards the compatibility, pedestrian orientation, and multimodal design emphasis, and that community building aspect, and thinking that these aren't necessarily, if they're well designed and well crafted and limited, that they shouldn't add much to housing, so you have to build it anyways, just build it facing the street kind of a thing, instead of a big side of a house with no windows is your streetscape.
Have you identified of the existing design standards, ones that you've flagged already as being subjective, as needing specifically to take a look at them? I mean, I have my opinion looking at the list, but has planning flagged certain ones?
I don't think we have, maybe we have.
Okay.
We've got a lot of files and a lot of folders. I think many of these are obviously subjective.
Yeah.
The 15% transparency, that's objective. Exterior stairs, that's objective. 10 feet space between buildings, that's objective. I think all the rest could be, yes. All the rest of them, I think, are subjective, but could be made objective. So vertical modulation could say every floor needs to have some difference in color or pattern. That,
Why?
well, I'm not saying we need to do that, but that would be objective, because it makes for a varied architecture and a more interesting streetscape that makes people want to walk down, stroll, and, yeah, if there are sidewalks.
I'm sorry, the context on these are ones these are just options we could have, because we don't have them for single family, right?
These are,
Detached.
this third column there, design standards, that's what those are. So currently in single-family zones, if you build a duplex or 3 or 4 units, you must fulfill all of those. So our, I think, initial thinking was to go through that list, probably pare it back, objectify the subjective ones, and then whatever it is, make whatever's left, then make that apply to all development. Because if it's a good idea for, well, this is my simple thought is, if it was a good idea for a duplex, it's a good idea for everything. But heard some good discussion on that this evening.
Yeah, I think my input would be that that's all subjective and it should not be there.
Yeah. Okay.
Agree.
Okay, great. I think that was, so we've kind of gone through, did we miss any topics or anything? We've got overarching considerations. We've got a paragraph on each one of these in the memo. I think it is getting late, but it is maybe worth page 4 of the memo, kind of thinking about each of these. We have to allow middle housing. I think we should allow middle housing. We have to allow middle housing. And then we have to do it right, and we have to address the impacts as a city. So the state didn't necessarily think through the implications on stormwater. They left that to us. And so these are some of the kind of things that we need to think through as we implement this. Maybe there's nothing that needs to be done. Maybe it's handled. Critical areas, I think, is one. Yes, we're going to have more development in proximity to wetlands and streams and steep slopes. But if our critical area regulations are designed right, those will continue to be adequately protected, all of their functions and values. It means cluster all of your development in places that don't impact critical areas. But are there landscape scale impacts that, like increased impervious surface in an entire neighborhood, that could impact critical areas? Potentially. That's just the kind of thing that I think we need to think through to get comfort level.
That exact issue is actually what I would love to see if there's any data on. As spaces densify, how does that impact, water's ability to seep into the ground if there's more areas where it can't, because it's a denser area. And gosh, I really miss Commissioner Zelinski, and I will miss him in discussions around this type, like the critical environmental areas. I feel like he really had a lot of insight in those specific issues, so.
Vancouver had some very specific requirements on water infiltration and water storage on site. And so there is that for their intensification. But with the amount of lot coverage that we're talking about, there's still a fair amount of space for drainage, considering the sizes on the properties. And we're still working through that, but I mean, there is a way to do some bioswales or some other things that would help too.
Thank you.
There does, just on the stormwater thing, it's something I'm very, well, we should all be very interested. We're building a city in the rain here. The individual developments will be reviewed against the stormwater manuals and the stormwater regulations. There are thresholds based on size that I can't remember right now, but it's like at 2,000 square feet of surface that is impervious or that is modified triggers stormwater review. 5,000 square feet of impervious or modified surface triggers treatment. And this is an example of what it is. I got to get my note sheet on that. And then a higher level triggers flow control as well. So we do review every development for stormwater management. We do require low impact development techniques, the rain gardens and the on-site stormwater management. And that also extends to trying to do our best to avoid disturbance where possible. So if you've got a patch of good, healthy ground, don't scrape it clean just to put back landscaping there if possible. Those have always been pretty challenging to require and implement. It's something that we're working, actually we just applied for a grant to review our low impact development practices and implementation, and middle housing would be a great place to put some of that into place. The last thing I want to mention on that is that we have these lot coverage requirements that we talked about in the last meeting, maximum lot coverage by building, that is sort of arbitrary. 55%, it's not for a particular function other than leaving most of the land not covered by building, maybe an aesthetic thing. Potentially, we could reduce that arbitrary number and turn to more performance standards that would still achieve the same result. Maybe we don't have much in the way of tree retention regulations, and I don't think we want to go too far into that because it makes development, which has the purpose of retaining trees at large, more difficult. But we could tilt a little bit towards low impact development, stormwater infiltration that will have the same result of about 50% lot coverage or something. So you wouldn't necessarily be impacting development, but you'd be prioritizing that open space into certain areas. And that's just a general idea for a trade-off that could be made.
Commissioners' thoughts, questions? With regard to the lot coverage, it would be nice to know at what point we have too much lot coverage where there is a negative impact to drainage and stormwater runoff. Because green spaces don't have to exist only on individual private property. There can be development of community green spaces where we can allow lot inability for water to drain properly where it should. So we should know the point at which it is a problem. We have too much, we're allowing too much lot coverage. It is a negative environmental impact because of what we're allowing. Because I think we should really try to push the limits on lot coverage and allow folks to develop housing in the way that is best for the community. I mean, we know this is a huge need, and the more ways we can untie the hands of property owners and developers and allow them to be creative, I think the better our city will fare in the future. But we don't want to do something that is going to be really deeply harmful to our beautiful natural environment that we all love so much. So it would be nice to know more about where that point is that we're kind of tipping over into a problematic space.
Sure. I think I'd love to invite our stormwater colleagues to help explain that, because it's a very complicated and developing world.
Well, you could still go back, or you could do away with lot coverage and still go to setbacks, but still require a drainage requirement, and you could still have a patio size. I mean, you could do that and just completely get rid of lot coverage.
So we talked a little bit about, other than stormwater and sidewalks, which we've already talked about, we'll make sure that there's enough power, water, and sewer for middle housing. That's something we're looking at in the environmental impact statement. Is there anything else on infrastructure, public services, fire review? The fire marshal will review these regulations, and will also review individual developments and make sure. One example with we've been hearing recently with accessory dwelling units is a desire policy, maybe getting towards a requirement that you have a walking path from the front of the street if a unit is on the alley that is marked with the address. The idea that if an aid car needs to come transport someone who's in an accessory dwelling unit that accessed from the alley, that the alley doesn't have a street name on it, and that the car may come to the front and then need to get to the back. And so there's a requirement that you have a couple 8 feet wide, I think it is, pathway to the back. So those types of considerations, of course, turnarounds for fire apparatuses and those sorts of things. So I think in general, those are handled through existing practices all around. I will mention with front setbacks that Snohomish Public Utility District, PUD, is is having to pivot a little bit with our reduced setbacks, and this is more like our mixed urban zone. Now that we're having taller buildings right to the street, that's where their utility poles had been hanging into. And so we're getting into more issues, and some of those are going underground in the more densely developed areas or with large subdivisions, but that front setback area is used for utilities frequently.
It's also happening actually for alley development. We've seen it a lot for ADUs coming through. There's a ton of utility poles along the alleyways. We do have resources available when folks come into the counter now. We've worked directly with PUD to try to get ahead of that so folks know ahead of time if they might need to, even if they have technically a 0-foot allowance off the alley, they might want to actually set it back to avoid certain moving of poles that can be required. So there's things like that to keep in mind.
It's a complicated city we have. Affordability, it's important to know that middle housing is not automatically going to mean affordable housing. I think said in the memo, it's going to range from deeply affordable basement conversion to luxury townhouses and everything in between. I think by having more housing supply and options, you're going to generally improve affordability, but results may differ for individual projects. There is the requirement in the middle housing law that we allow 6 units per development if 2 of them are affordable and income qualified and covenanted. I think we're satisfying that requirement with our approach, which is if you have the right size shaped lot, you can build unlimited housing. The 6 per lot ignores the size of the lot. So I think we're meeting that requirement without having to develop a major program for administering 1 and 2 affordable units per development. But we still may want to look at some incentive for those. It seems a little bit difficult to track 150 properties that each have 1 unit. It's hard enough for us to track and administer the multifamily tax exemption program, which is 30, 40 affordable units in a larger apartment building. But those affordability, if we can find a way to incentivize or otherwise get those income qualified and restricted units, that would be helpful. Deregulation also is another way to provide just naturally occurring affordable housing. Racially disparate impacts and displacement. Again, I think our general opinion is that middle housing is helping to improve inclusion in the city and redress some of the past exclusionary practices that we've had. The improvement in affordability at a citywide scale is going to help with that inclusion. Bringing more affordable units to neighborhoods that are more rich with amenities, we think should help with that. We did a review and linked into this memo as part of the Commerce Middle Housing Grant Work Program last year on equity and displacement issues. We looked at the focus for displacement concerns around middle housing would be low-income renters of single-family houses, which do exist in the city, but on a review, we did not find any major concentrations of which that would lead us to suggest excluding a certain area from allowing middle housing because it would have the potential to displace low-income renters. That does not mean that that is not going to happen with middle housing. There are definitely people that are renting a house from an investor who is going to jump at the opportunity to terminate that lease and redevelop. Our hope is that, and our expectation, more than a hope, our plan and expectation is that by improving affordability that we're going to find a landing spot for that household and more. Still worth taking a close look at. Historic resources. Right now we have one historic overlay that allows middle housing on half of it. That's the Norton Grand, the southern portion of the Norton Grand historic overlay. Most of the other ones only allow single family or some duplexes and then accessory dwelling units. By extending middle housing, potentially you have the possibility that more contributing structures or historic resources could be impacted through middle housing. We have not thought that to be significant enough of an impact to warrant prohibiting middle housing in these historic overlays. Development be subject to review by the Historical Commission for design regulations in a much more comprehensive way than these other design standards that we've been talking about. We think the value of a well-maintained historic home should be such that it would not make economic sense to tear it down. Maybe conversions or making it converting the interior into a duplex or something like that. But still, again, worth some thought on. And then public participation.
Can I ask a
Oh,
quick
yeah,
question
please.
about that? Has the Historic Commission, have they identified any spaces in the city that they think might be a problem for these new middle housing regulations that are coming? Do they have any recommendations of specific areas that we should be considering?
I don't remember hearing concern about middle housing. I think it was acceptance of it seems to be working okay in the southern half of Norton Grand, so that would apply elsewhere. There was more concern about the bigger stuff, so the low-rise, mid-rise, or more on the borders of these historic overlays. And at least some historical commissioners wanted buffer zones, so no mid-rise, low-rise within a couple blocks of a historic overlay. But I don't remember at least a lot of concern about the middle housing aspect.
Okay, thank you.
And then public participation, I think, we're in the middle of a May, June public outreach push. We're visiting as many neighborhood associations and boards and commissions. Tabling at Sorticulture will be there if anybody wants to stop by and talk to staff, and many other of our spring events. We're working in this middle housing into those information sessions, and I think the more definition that we get, so now that we've had these discussions with the Planning Commission, I think that'll start to feature a little bit more. I think we'll have a dedicated walkthrough with the council briefing on middle housing. It's its own topic, separate from the rest of the comprehensive plan, although integrated with it. And we'll continue to share that story and share what we hear from the public back with you. I don't think I have any really strong sentiments to convey yet.
I would say the only thing that we're hearing from the community is, what do you mean? My house can be a duplex, or my house, that my neighborhood is going to change, and that there will not be single family anymore, and that they feel that it's going to happen right away. And it's like, no, this isn't a today thing. It's not a tomorrow thing. It's as your neighbors may choose to sell or whatever, but there's just a little bit of confusion, the fact that single family zoning is no longer.
Commissioner Shelby, you have comment eyes.
Oh, yeah, sorry. All the way back to infrastructure and public services. I would love to hear from Fire their view on, the difference in potential impact based on the increased density, right? Like, so what comes down to, not just apparatus access, but like integral suppression, that kind of thing, where like, is that something that we should be considering? Like, yeah, it's going to add a little bit to the cost of the house, but if you've got 5 or 6 units that are close to each other, they're far closer than they used to be potentially. One fire here is going to impact this unit, or another dwelling unit, and then we've got 2 families that are displaced. So I would love to hear their view on that.
Additional questions, comments, commissioners? Is it bedtime? Yeah, I think so. We do have a final opportunity for public comment. Do we have anyone online who wants to comment?
No comment.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. Anything further,
Thank you,
York?
commissioners.
Okay, all
Appreciate
right.
your work on this.
We are adjourned. Thank you.